クロスディグ101始まります。今日は、カーティス・ヤーヴィン氏という人を、インタビューします。世界が注目するこの暗黒思想を唱えている、政治思想家なんですね。で、日本でもこのネオ君主論という本を、最近出しています。で、彼はですね、まず、いろんな議論がある人なんですが、私自身はこの本を読んで、相当考えに反対してます。つまり今の、民主主義というのはワークしなくて、それで君主がいるべきだと、あるいは、もう CEO みたいな、国家、大統領を置くべきだっていう話をしてるんですね。ただ、かつてはこの人ブロガーだったんですが、今は相当いろんな影響力を持っているとされています。アメリカのメディアでも、ニューヨーカーとか、いろんな主要メディアが、プロファイル記事というか彼の特集をしたりとか、あと副大統領でもしかしたら次期大統領になるかもしれない、JD バンスも彼のことを引用したりとか、あとはですね、もともとカーティス・ヤーヴィンというのは起業家でもあって、コンピューターサイエンスが専門なので、会社を作ってピーター・ティールに出資してもらって、そこともつながりがあるんですね。で、ピーター・ティールは当然パランティアという、最近話題のこのテクノリパブリックという本の、にも関わっている、人です。つまりアメリカで今じゃあ何が起きているかって、この思想の源流の原理を知るために、今日はあえて長時間にわたって、彼の話を聞いてですね、その思想の根っこの部分を探りたいと思います。今アメリカは本当に大きな、革命的といわれる変化にあります。で、トランプさんが当時はもちろんそうなんですが、一つはこの民主主義がうまくいってないんだっていう問題意識、そしてもう一つはですね、いろんなテック企業が出てきて、Facebook とか Twitter、X が出てきたんだけど、結局は作ったのはこれソーシャルメディアだったんだと、もっと大きなことをテック企業、私人類はやんなきゃいけないんだっていう問題意識が蔓延しています。で、そういう意味でこういうパランティアみたいな会社が出てきて、軍事と AI を結びつけたりとか、要するにビッグプロジェクトをやろうとしていると。で、その源流となる考えが、なぜそういった考えが起きるのかと、特にこの考えがですね、例えば暴力、軍事政権と結びついてしまうと非常に世界にとってもリスクなので、その辺の話を聞いてみたいと思います。で、このアメリカの新右翼とかですね、テックライトっていうのは優れた本がたくさん出てまして、例えば石田健さんのカウンターエリートっていう本も後で概要欄に書いておきますので読むといいですし、あと私もすごく勉強させてもらってます。木澤聡さんの加速主義、この増歩新版というのが出てきて、ニックランドと新反動主義とか、あとはですね、井上弘隆さんのアメリカの新右翼とか、今日はちょっと全体のコンテクストまでお話しできる時間がないので、インタビュー見る前とかですね、見た後にリンクを概要欄に貼っておきますので、ぜひこういった本も私も勉強になりましたので、合わせて読んでいただくといいかなと思います。で、おそらく彼はですね、アメリカや民主主義の課題について、いろんなことを言うと思うんですよね。結論にはもしかしたら賛成できなくても、じゃあ皆さんはこのアメリカや民主主義どこの部分に課題があると思うかを、私自身はもう少し民主主義を信じたいんですが、どこに課題があるか、ぜひ意見とかをコメント欄でお寄せいただけたら嬉しいです。では早速、今アメリカにいるカーティス・ヤーヴィンさんとつないで、彼の思想の源流には何があるのか、どんなロジックで語っていくということを探っていきたいと思います。So, Curtis Yarvin-san, welcome to our show.
Great pleasure.
So you have your new book in Japanese. It's called Neo Kunshi Ron, which means the Neo Prince, the defeat of democracy and the age of the tech right. And just to say for our audience, so you graduated Brown, went to UC Berkeley, you started your own company, which was funded by Peter Thiel, and you're famous for your blogs, and you're a political thinker. And also JD Vance cites you, and also Peter Thiel. And so in order to make things real, are you saying that we should get rid of democracy, the liberal democracy, and start the monarchy?
What I say to Americans who are like, oh, I could never live in a monarchy is typically what I will do. I will hold up my iPhone and I will say, well, on the back of this iPhone, it says designed by Apple in California, assembled in China. And so here is your democracy versus monarchy. All right, designed by Apple. That's a monarchy because every company is a monarchy because that's the only way you can run any large enterprise. In California, that's not a monarchy, but it is a one-party state, and manufactured in China, which is both a monarchy and a one-party state. And you're just like, of all of these three systems, the one that works the worst is clearly the government of California.
Well, I kind of agree with you, but I just want to push back because I know Apple is kind of a monarchy. It's like an empire, but you can always choose not to buy an iPhone, or you can always choose not to buy the product.
That's
but if it's a king, you cannot throw away the king.
So two things. One is that some people who believe in monarchy are just like, I think Dante has a thing about this. He believes that the world should all be one monarchy with one king who is also the Pope, right? And I think that would be a somewhat dangerous condition for humanity. I think that generally, the real success, it's this corporate form, literally the joint stock company that was invented by the Dutch and later spread to the English. And I believe it's basically that organizational design is responsible. I think it caused the Industrial Revolution. I think if the Romans had the joint stock company, I can't see how the empire would have fallen. And it's a way of building what I call an accountable monarchy, because typically in a corporation, there are exceptions. You basically have a board of directors who does not run the company, who does not actually manage the company, but provides accountability. And separating that accountability from the management, because management is the exercise of power, and power corrupts in a way. And so you have this body standing outside that system that says, are you doing a good job or not? And let's look, for example, at the case of Apple. Actually, the board has done very, very well with Apple because the board saved Apple by bringing in the right CEO, Steve Jobs, in the 1990s. Since then, the board has done almost nothing, right? They're just like, yep, seems to be going well, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And you want your board to actually be doing nothing. It should be, there's in Taoism, I believe there's this idea that the strongest king is the king who does least, right? It's like this is the paradox of Taoism. And, government is always like that. Government is always like, actually, you have a pencil standing on its point. And if you're not working, this is sort of what libertarians miss. They're like, oh, we should just put the pencil on its point and everything will be fine. No, it will fall over. You always need what Carl Schmitt calls the exception, that you can you always need a power that there's nothing in charge of, right? And so having that power that is unaccountable, where there's nobody watching the watchdogs, is really something that you can't get away from. Now, there are some companies like Facebook, for example. Mark Zuckerberg is completely in control of Facebook. He has no board. Works fine. Obviously, we've had many great absolute monarchs throughout history. Also has worked fine. One of the things about people are always, but how will you get a perfect king? And I'm like, look around you. Does it seem perfect? Right. I'm just like, wow, you have a very bad situation and you're looking for a perfect situation. That is the definition of dysfunction. But you also want to do as well as possible. So if you look at, for example, accountability mechanisms gradually moving in the direction of political power. Let's take, for example, what I think is probably the most powerful institution in the world today. I refer to the New York Times. I think that if basically the New York Times, if aliens came to the world and basically were like, we want one institution that is going to be as powerful as possible, what would it be? You would be like, yes, you should take the New York Times. It's definitely stronger than the White House. Right. And the New York Times, as you may know, is a fifth generation hereditary monarchy. And the way that it is governed is very interesting. It is a public company. They have two classes of shares, A shares and B shares. The B shares, I believe, are normal corporate shares with no voting power, whatever. They just get dividends. The A shares have all the votes, and the only people who own A shares are biological descendants of Adolf Ox, who died in the 1880s or something, right? And so this is something this is a classic. It's you go people who, if the New York Times told them that their mother was an eagle, right? They would believe it, right? And they would be like, but we can't have monarchy. And I'm like, oh, honey, and actually, and so actually getting away from these kind of sovereign institutions. Like, there's no constitution for the New York Times. Nothing sort of gave it its power. Its power is arbitrary, and it rests on it is because it is, right? It's like a sort of might makes right question. If we look at, there's a very similar organization that's the way Saudi Arabia is run. Saudi Arabia is governed by the descendants of Ibn Saud. I don't think they have shares or anything. I think it's a sort of more primitive process, but they basically find like who's going to be the next king, and they find someone who, you know, for better or for worse, is very dynamic and effective. And the like, so actually the sort of the ways of saying the fundamental problem, if you look at the sort of the fair reasons why people are afraid of monarchy, it's very simple. It's a single point of failure, as we say in engineering code. It's like, you know, there's a part in a helicopter called the Jesus nut. The Jesus nut is the piece that holds the blades onto the mast. That has to be one part. If it fails, you're gone. Everything else on the helicopter can fail and you live, but if the Jesus nut fails, you're done, right? And so the thing is that actually, like, designing, first of all, I would be a little worried if the world was one monarchy. What typically happens, what's happened throughout history, is that states that are badly governed become weak, and basically because they become weak, they tend to disappear. And and so you can't have this kind of cancerous spread of misgovernment to the entire planet. Now, military technology has changed. There's a lot of forces that sort of want to unify the planet. It's important to sort of push back against those. I think a politically unified planet is a very bad thing. In fact, I'm a real, probably very supportive of the old Tokugawa policy of Sakoku. I think that if that had persisted, Japan would be a very interesting and I think in many ways much better place.
Let me just go to the Tokugawa period just for a minute. Let me just pause here. So it's interesting you mentioned the New York Times, and maybe that's exactly the reason we don't want the king or the prince, because we don't want the government to be family owned. You know, even we don't want like the Clintons and the Bushes to like take turns becoming a president. So how can we be accountable because of not having that king or the monarchy become a family-owned government? How can we stop that?
So you have to basically push back against the things, you know, where there's a great line that I often quote by the English, you know, poet Alexander Pope, who said, "For forms of government, let fools contest. Whatever governs best is best." And so when your approach toward a government is to say, well, how do I feel about this government? I'm like, or this form of government, this system, this dynasty, whatever. And your question is anything else besides, is it doing a good job? Like, you have to wonder in a way, because actually, like, there's another motivation that people have, which is jealousy and envy, and they want status, they want to matter. And this is, of course, what Peter Thiel and Rene Girard are constantly talking about. You know, this desire to rebel against and sort of tend to kill the king is sort of ever present in a way. And it sort of comes from the natural feeling that if I have no, you know, think about chimpanzees. We're all descended at very great distance from chimpanzees. And so they have this very crude way of being that I think we can learn, you know, that you know, humans can learn something from. The reality is that if you're a chimpanzee and you get to be the chief chimp, you will have a lot more little chimp babies. And so you really want to be the chief chimp. How do you get to be the chief chimp? You form a coalition with the bottom chimps, and, you know, all 6 of you get together and knock off the chief chimp, right? And this happens to all chief chimps, right? And so when you're basically, when the way you look at, say, oh, we can't have a king, we can't have an emperor or something, is not to say, oh, this is not, our country is not flourishing under, like, say, Stalin or whatever. Yes, the Soviet Union in many ways is not flourishing under Stalin. China is not flourishing under Mao. But the thing is, the observation that China is not flourishing under Mao comes from a good and healthy place. The observation that China is not flourishing under Mao, but maybe it would flourish under me, right? That's not coming from as good a place. And so the thing is, that feeling of, like, it's righteous to be a rebel, it's righteous to basically, it's the feeling of kind of any, progressivism is an aristocratic system. It's the rule of prestigious institutions. It's the rule of, like, decentralized systems in which you're sort of tested at every stage of your career. Do I deserve this? Do I deserve that? Do I, like, as you climb this ladder, it's hardly a unique system in sort of human affairs. And so basically, what anyone involved in climbing that ladder for often very, very minuscule amounts of actual power create status. And then someone looks at this and is like, well, all the status is going to one person or one family. How can that be fair? I'm basically like, the moment you say, how is government power distributed? And your concern is that that distribution be fair rather than the government being effective. I'm just like, well, you know what? If you have a success criterion, which is the Alexander Pope criterion, and you say, well, but we have this other criterion that power should be distributed fairly, but that's not going to affect my first criterion, like, my friend, you're dreaming, right? And so when we look specifically at especially family government, why has the family government worked so well, for example, for the New York Times? The New York Times in specific basically there are a lot of incentives for anything that's at the top of the market to go down market. You can always make more money by lowering your standards. And, like, because it's a family business, the people who are running it are like, I'm preserving this not just for myself, but for hundreds of years. Conversely, if you have a system that's really a democracy in the old 19th century sense of the word, where the politicians are really in control of the government and can do whatever they want, then it's like, oh, I just got elected for 4 years. What can I do in 4 years that's good? And how can I feather my nest and make money in the next? It's like it's a time preference problem. And so really to govern a country is like, it's like growing a tree that will last hundreds of years. And you can't be thinking of the next 2 or 3 years in terms of that. So when you have a family that is basically like, as long as whoever is, there's this, as far as the purpose of government, there's this great Latin phrase, salus populi suprema lex. The health of the people shall be the supreme law. The flourishing of the people shall be the supreme law. And as long as your government is following that, I don't care if they're blue three-armed octopi from the star system Vega. If their interests are aligned with the interests of the nation and the people, then, like, the idea that we should be jealous of them because they have all the power and we have no power, like, that's a destructive idea. I would say that's actually really a bad idea. And in as much as that's sort of the idea behind what we call democracy, it's just a bad idea. As when we think of what we call democracy as how do we hold the government accountable, that's one thing. But actually, like, the ability, the power of the inside Washington, I grew up inside Washington. My father worked in the State Department. So I'm just like, actually, it's a sort of very ugly thing or very real thing or very ineffective thing that is sort of concealed beneath these euphemisms. So it's really, as Confucius said, to rectify the state, we first must rectify the meanings of words. And that's why I'm just like, when you ask, should we abolish democracy? I'm like, that doesn't mean anything to me, but we should definitely abolish the word democracy.
I see.
Because the word democracy is a loaded word.
So let's talk about real life examples about President Trump. So first of all, in a scale of like 1 to 100, 100 being the best, how do you rate the current President Trump administration?
Well, I think the important way to start is, you're familiar with the distinction of David Hume between is and ought, between fact judgments and value judgments.
And ought, yes.
So in a way, the judgment, the question that you're asking is value judgment, and I would prefer to define it in terms of a related fact judgment. I would say, actually, what percentage of the powers, I would say the right question is, how powerful is the Trump administration? And the correct, because we can't really know how good a job it's doing until we know how powerful it is. Moreover, when we say how powerful is it, first of all, there's a very interesting division between domestic power and international power, because essentially the president is the president of the United States, but also he is the president of the world because things happened in the 20th century. And so you have this dual role of this figure, not unusual in history. There's the same, Mikhail Gorbachev had the same role, right? And and so when you look at the president's role in terms of the second thing, when you have a scale like that, a scale of power, you need to calibrate that scale. You're like, okay, this is the scale from 0 to 100. What is 0? What is 100? And I think a good way to calibrate 0 is like nothing at all, like no power whatsoever, like the King of England or the Emperor of Japan, right?
Like a symbol, yeah.
Yeah, like a thimble,
yes.
right? You know, and so what is 100? I don't know that we've seen 100 in the United States, but we've certainly seen maybe 80 or 90. Let's just go ahead and peg that at Franklin Roosevelt.
Okay.
So Franklin Roosevelt was really the CEO of the United States. He was so powerful that the American voters who elected him did not know that he used a wheelchair. He managed to conceal basically, you're just like, wow, that is how powerful power is, right? You know, and power, like if people can make you live in a world that isn't true, they can make you do anything, right?
So he was 80 in your sense, 80%.
80 out of 100. 80 out of 100. Okay. 80 out of 100. And in foreign policy, Trump is perhaps 15 or 20 out of 100. And in domestic policy, maybe 1 or 2.
One or two. And the thing is, because actually the domestic, what we call the executive branch in Washington is really the legislative branch. It is entirely dictated by Congress. And when you look at all of the things that, let's say things that I'm like personally interested in, like the latest like cryptocurrency bill before the Senate, the Clarity Act or whatever, that's an important government decision. There's no involvement of the White House in it. It is basically a bunch of horse trading in Congress. Moreover, and actually one of the things you realize from inside Washington, D.C., if the White House entirely ceased to exist, life in the so-called executive branch would change barely at all. It would continue functioning. It functions entirely on a bottom-up basis. There are certain ways to kind of steer it to some extent from a top-down, but they are very limited. There's some things. Has Trump sealed the borders, for example? He has. That's not really a permanent thing because anyone can make a hole in a fence. But in terms of the domestic impact, you could walk around San Francisco all day and you would have, the place would be no different than if Trump had never won the election in 2016 or 2024. Because, as a person living outside the United States, we see the ICE, the border.
We see all of these things.
But no power.
We see what you're seeing is imagine a person who's a hypochondriac. Right? He's worried that he has cancer. One day he sees a little spot on his hand and he's like, oh my God, that could be cancer. And it's just this little spot and he gets a magnifying glass and he looks at it through the magnifying glass and it's just this massive boiling dysfunctional cells, right? And it's actually just a little spot. And that is how hypochondria works. And that is also how, when basically you're sort of directing attention with a purpose. The point is actually the lie that Donald Trump is powerful in this way is what we call a folie à deux. Because actually not only is it in the interests of the press to portray Trump as a real king, he also wants to portray himself that way as well. And so he is also complicit in this lie. I'll tell you something, a personal story from when Trump was elected for the first time in 2016. I was talking to my 6-year-old, and, he's going to school at a progressive, he's doing Mandarin immersion. He was learning Chinese in San Francisco. And, all the kids in elementary school, they talk and they have these inflated things. Trump is going to kill all the Muslims. He's going to nuke, something, whatever. And my son comes to me with a very realistic concern. And he's like, how are we going to be able to go to the beach? And I'm like, what? What do you have beach? He's like, now he's convinced that I'm a complete idiot. He's like, Pop, when Trump is elected, I'm like, I know. And he's like, how are we going to be able to go to the beach when Trump builds a wall around the country? Right? And I was like, oh, it was just perfect 6-year-old logic. He took it literally. And I said to him, if you see anything change with your own eyes because of this election, I will be very surprised. Are there changes in some places on the margin? Sure. Compare that to the fall of East Germany. There's no violence at all in the fall of East Germany. Everything just collapses very neatly. It's like a company going out of business. It's not like the French Revolution or whatever. And everyone's life changes. And that's when you see a real change in government, everyone's life changes. Meiji Restoration, everyone's life changes. 1945, everyone's life changes, right? And so the thing is, we're having these elections that are they're like American professional wrestling in a way, where basically both, even the winner and the loser, both want to pretend that something real is going on. People know that nothing real is going on, so they kind of check out of democracy. They don't really care about these elections. They know that nothing in their lives will change because of the election, but then they notice that things are going rather badly, and so they're like, maybe I should take an interest in this.
I see.
And that's
change
the
president.
That's
but
the
there's still the bureaucracy is still left.
The bureaucracy is still there, and
so
the thing is, to actually change that, you have to have more than one to change it. You have to know where you're going with it. So, for example, in England, the Reform Party, which is one of the populist parties there, led by Nigel Farage, just released a manifesto where they're like, we're going to take charge we're going to be in charge of the bureaucracy. And I'm like, guys, English politicians have been trying to take charge of the English bureaucracy for 150 years. They've been saying they will do that. They'll be like, we're in charge. And they get into number 10 Downing Street, and they're like, we're in charge. And the bureaucracy is like, absolutely right, sir. You're in charge. What would you like us to do next? Right. And of course, it's like the Batman movie. Do you feel in charge? And actually, and it's like, if you were in charge even for a second, you would actually fire all of these people because they don't work for you and they can't work for you. And actually building a new government would be much, much easier. It's California, we do this all the time. We build new companies, whoosh, out of the ground. We have a problem to solve, it's done, right? And actually, it is so patently obvious that let's take something like NASA, for example. So NASA was originally the Nazi space program, as you may know, and the Americans kidnapped the Nazi space program and took it to Alabama with the same director and 1,000 of the same scientists and all of that. And this very effective Nazi space program put an American on the moon, and it was one of basically the two great American science and engineering projects of the 20th century are the Manhattan Project and the Apollo program. The Apollo program was run by Nazis, and the Manhattan Project is run by communists, right? So maybe that tells you something about democracy. I don't know. But I'm not saying that makes you want to be either a Nazi or a communist. Both of those are very bad movements, right? But the thing is that over time, the Manhattan Project turns into what we now call the Department of Energy. The most inefficient organization, and one of the most inefficient organizations in the U.S. government. NASA turns into NASA today, which can barely get anything done. And you see, basically, here you have a direct comparison between bureaucracy and monarchy, because SpaceX is very much a monarchy. And SpaceX, with much less money, gets much more done in space than NASA. Furthermore, there's another company, Blue Origin, The origin, it's the Jeff Bezos space company, and it is way behind SpaceX because they said, well, we're a monarchy, but we're going to do everything the NASA way. And we're going to hire a bunch of NASA people. And Elon Musk was like, no, we're going to hire a bunch of really smart 23-year-old people straight out of college, and we're going to work them to death and replace them when they're dead. Right. And that's why his rockets go like this. Right. He runs it like a wartime operation. Right. He runs it like the Manhattan Project. He runs it like it's a war. Right. You know, and he runs it absolutely like a king. And when we look at, for example, the Manhattan Project, one of the things we notice is there's a variation on monarchy that works very well, that has been popular throughout history. It's the diarchy. It's two in a box. So the Roman Republic uses this form. They always have the two consuls. Right. Rome becomes great under this system, and then under, you know, the political system doesn't work anymore. They need a monarchy, and then they sort of gradually decay under that. But the monarchy saves Rome.
So they're like 2 points. Yes.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. And so, but what's funny is that in Silicon Valley, when we do a startup, which is the ultimate monarchy here, we reinvented, without, I think, knowing it or being inspired by it, we reinvented the Roman form. And we have the two co-founders. You know, the word might as well be consul, right? You know, sometimes you have three that doesn't work as well. Sometimes you have one that doesn't work as well. And you look at the Manhattan Project and you're like, this is run exactly like a startup, but it's inside the government. Right, you have Groves, and you have who's the non-technical co-founder, and you have Oppenheimer, and like basically, you know, the whole thing actually works very, very well. And so, you know, when we see things that are like governments, whether they're like one layer down or they're like strange foreign things like Saudi Arabia, or they're things like the New York Times, which pretends to be a private corporation but is really an unaccountable sovereign government agency, I would assert, we see sort of all of these ways in which basically like the kind of classical knowledge of how to build of statecraft really is kind of creeping back into the world as we understand it sort of after this kind of almost, you know, the way I see World War II is really almost as a kind of utopian jihad by the Anglo-American world. And the like, and it makes sense to me that those people were so confident in knowing how to do things that they felt the right to take over the world. And they sort of felt in a way that might makes right, that like we're the strongest, we should rule. And like in many ways, they fulfilled that promise. You know, for example, as you may know, the post-war occupation of Germany is much more brutal than the occupation of Japan. The occupation of Japan is really not very brutal at all. Arguably, there were some war crimes trials that went too far, but there's nothing like Germany, nothing like what happens in Germany. That's all due to one man, Douglas MacArthur. And the thing is, MacArthur is, again, he's a monarch. He becomes king of Japan, really. How does he know how to be king of Japan? Well, it turns out that his father, Arthur MacArthur, was the king of the Philippines. Right, you know, and so we see these forms like sort of coming back again and again in ways that work. Like, you know, and so when you basically say everyone is like, well, Donald Trump is too much of a king, I'm like, no, actually, my problem with him is that he's not enough of a king.
That's an interesting point because you mentioned that he only has 1 or 2% of power out of 100.
Yeah.
So you're basically saying that in a democracy, we change presidents, but it's like a fake revolution and nothing's changing. But
it's like a fake revolution and nothing's changing. And then what happens periodically is that someone comes in and it's like, why don't we have a real revolution? And they actually make things actually change. So Franklin Roosevelt does this in his own way. He's like basically about every 75 or 80 years, it's like Halley's Comet or the San Andreas Fault. You can set your watch by it. Basically, America has a king. And they're like, no, why don't we have a real election this time? And whoever wins the election will actually be in charge of the government. I have a word for it. We could call it democracy, right? You know, and so it's this kind of yin-yang irony that kind of keeps coming back in a way because someone, oh, that's not democracy, that's fascism. Democracy is that the New York Times is in charge with its 5th generation hereditary monarchy, like, you know, self-correcting It's a self-watching watchdog. We won't have any problems with that. You talked about me being funded by Peter Thiel. How did that happen? That happened. I go in front of him. I know to be able to, you have to know someone who knows him, basically.
Yes.
You have to have a connection to get there. But anyone
Mm-hmm.
who gets a connection, he gets the same. I stand in front of him for like 20 minutes. I deliver a slide. He's not even technical. He's not a computer scientist. I'm doing like very advanced, abstruse computer science. He's not even a computer scientist.
He's a venture capitalist. Yeah.
He's a venture capitalist.
Yeah.
He has to judge 10 years of my work in 10 minutes without
Right.
any technical knowledge.
I've lived in Silicon Valley, in the Bay Area, so I know that things are easy, very fast, very quick. So you're saying that the president should be like a CEO of a tech company. So in order to do that, let's say J.D. Vance will be elected as president in a few years. How can that change? Because should you guys change the whole United States system, or how can the president be like a CEO?
I think that we've increasingly gotten to a situation where you actually have to, you can't change anything unless you change everything. And that is obvious in retrospect when we look at a place like East Germany. We're just like, how would you reform East Germany? There's no way. You could replace it with the West. You can't fix it. You can't, and the more you're thinking in terms of how do you fix this, the more you're missing, the picture. So for example, the president is not the chief executive of the executive branch in practice. So the first thing to say would basically say, hey, I just got elected president. Here's the Constitution. As you see, it says that I'm the chief executive of the executive branch. That's currently being interpreted in a way that is contrary to the meanings of plain English, that really says the Supreme Court and the Congress is in charge of the executive branch. That is not the way the system was designed. It is not the way the system worked originally under George Washington. And actually, I'm going to interpret it as saying I'm going to be like FDR, and I'm just going to run the country. And if Congress, FDR controlled Congress, so it wasn't an issue. But you could also say if Congress complains, maybe they can send a letter to me and I'll consider what they have to say. Because actually, of course, Congress today in the present system is both very democratic because the House of Representatives is elected every 2 years. You're like, oh, they change the whole system everybody every 2 years. Well, there's a 98% incumbency rate. It's basically there are mechanisms, and then they have a seniority system. And so in a way, Congress is like the breakwater against the way in which the waves of democracy break. They basically, Congress is there to subdue democracy and to be immune to it. It's like a harbor where these lobbyists and activists can basically do their smelly deals about laws that are this thick, right? And and nobody loves it. So Congress, this body that really is the government of the United States, when people ask for its popularity rating, they will get numbers that are usually between 10 and 20%. I think now it might even be up in the high 20s. It might be as high as 30. But actually, this is the real government and people hate it. And so actually, when you just turn it off and you say, hey, we're just not going to take this seriously at all, nothing happens. It's just over. And this is also what happened when Boris Yeltsin decided to ignore the USSR. He's like, I'm the president of Russia. People are like, what is the Russian Federation? Is this BS fake entity that doesn't even really exist? And Yeltsin's like, no, but I'm going to make it real in a sort of Meiji-like kind of way, in some senses, you might say. And so the first challenge of someone like that is to say, all right, we just had an election and this was a real election. And this time it's for real and I'm actually in charge of the government. Then you look at that and you're like, well, you're in charge of the executive branch of the federal government. But the police don't work for the federal government. They work for the states. We have this whole system of 50 states that are even the name state means that you're in an independent country, which they once were to some extent, and now they're just provinces, right? But imagine if I don't know how it works in Japan, but in America, every state has its own motor vehicles bureau.
Yeah.
So there are 50 different departments of motor vehicles, all of which are terrible, right? And people are like, well, yeah, but maybe there's Arkansas needs its own DMV because there's like an Arkansas way of driving, which is not the same way that they drive in Oregon. And I'm like, are you for real? Right? And I'm just like, actually, there are all these things that are just like, if you were designing it from scratch, you would never do it that way. And once you basically start tearing down the temples and tearing down the old icons and being like, you're not trying to leave a wilderness there. People still need license plates. Cars still need to be managed. But, basically to sort of do the right thing there with how are America's cars managed is to say, this idea that people care about their state governments is like something 100, 200 years old, means nothing. Forget it. It's done. And actually, we need one DMV. And the way we're going to build one national DMV is not we're going to try to take all these 50 DMVs and integrate them into one thing. Oh, no, we're just going to put Palantir on them. We're going to take all the data out, and we're going to use that data to build a new thing. And our new thing will have like 1% of the employees of the old thing, and it will work 20 times better.
So you guys don't need any more governors. You just have one whole system, and that can work.
Yeah, because actually we have one whole system in practice anyway. And so the remnants of the old system that people like love and respect, it's like basically an alien came to your house and ate your grandmother's body and is wearing your grandmother's skin. And you basically go to like shoot the alien in your head, and your sister stops you and is like, don't shoot grandma. And I'm like, I'm sorry, like, that's not grandma. Right. And like basically like whatever you're thinking, Americans, especially Republican Americans, have this sort of great respect for sort of like tradition and like, and all of this respect has been kind of systematically weaponized by their enemies who actually, Democrats, when they control the Supreme Court, are just like, this is the voice of God. This is the College of Cardinals. How could you disrespect these people? As soon as and this switchover's happened multiple times, as soon as the Republicans get a majority, they're just like, who wants to listen to these old guys? In the 1930s, when they were against Roosevelt, they were called 9 old men. They're like, we have to have term limits. We have to expand the court. We have to so it's like basically, there's an old Texas saying, which is, don't piss down my neck and tell me it's raining. And, I hope you can translate that.
Yes.
And
it's difficult to translate, but I know what you mean, yes.
Yeah, indeed. And so one of the things that we see in Trumpism is that like Republican Americans have grown very tired of basically being told to respect these traditions by people who actually hate tradition. And I'm like, no, you're not my grandma, And so actually like waking up to that a little bit has been, an important aspect of this. It's like I think for me, one of the most important political essays just from my development of the 20th century is an essay by Alexander Solzhenitsyn called As Breathing and Consciousness Return. And it's actually an attack on another dissident who was Andrei Sakharov, also a very famous dissident, invented the hydrogen bomb. And Sakharov is trying to be a moderate dissident. And so he's like, basically like, I want the regime to respect me. I agree with them about this, about that, about all these other things. But like, I question their judgment on this. And and Solzhenitsyn is just like, we lived in a world of lies for so long. We don't know what is up and what is down. What does it mean, this word democracy? What is it like? What does any of this stuff mean? Like, first, we have to realize that we're waking up from a deep sleep and we don't know. We just don't know. We don't know where we are. We don't know what's going on. History offers us, the technology offers us. Here's another example is that basically there are two things that you can do in monarchy today that you couldn't do in the past. One of the big problems that monarchies always had was biology. You need biological heirs. You're Henry VIII. You don't have a son. And the whole country falls apart because the egg and the sperm didn't do the right thing, right? Fix problem, solve problem now. You can have 100 princes. You can send them to Prince's Academy. You can give them, personality tests to make sure that like pick the best one. Like that's actually very, very easy. So actually, even hereditary monarchy in the 21st century, as long as you're regarding it as not something to be jealous of, but just like a part, like the Jesus nut, like you want your Jesus nut to be really solid, and you admit that you have to have a Jesus nut. On the other hand, another way that you can go for a 21st century monarchy is that you can do a board of directors, because it used to be like, oh, how do you do the board of directors in the public sector? Because how can the king be accountable to the directors if he can just arrest them?
Right.
Right.
Because the king has the power, and like compared to
the king
CEO,
has all the power.
Yeah, all the
exactly,
power.
exactly. So we have a solution to that now. It's called the blockchain. You can actually have anonymous directors. These people are the trustees, but nobody knows who they are. And then it's like, well, okay, how do they have any power if no one who knows who they are? Again, we have a blockchain solution for that. So you can say this is already done for nuclear weapons right now. So the nuclear weapons, the nuclear football, the guy standing next to the president has the suitcase at all times. The suitcase contains basically what's essentially a 1960s crypto wallet. I'm not kidding. It's a 1960s crypto wallet, and it contains the launch codes. It basically contains the token that makes the president because only he has the power to launch nuclear weapons. Okay, it's 2026. You can apply that to even a handgun. Gun people hate it when I say this, by the way. American gun people are like, you cannot do this smart gun thing. I'm like, you know what, you can, and it works. The result is actually the anonymous directors have tremendous power because they say who the legitimate king is, the legitimate CEO is, and if you work for the legitimate CEO and you have military weapons, your weapons work. And if you're opposed to the legitimate CEO, your weapons don't work. So who's going to win that one, right? And so you can actually this is, I'm sorry, it sounds like science fiction. It is science fiction. I'm living in a science fiction world today. Let's admit it. We live in science fiction, right? And so actually you need that level of imagination. There's a line from Paul Kruger, who was president of the South African Republic in the Boer War period. And he said, he was asked for, what does it mean to lead a country into the 20th century? And he was had this great line. He said, take what was best from the past and use it to build the future. So we can't go back to the past. We can't turn the clock back. We can't, but there are a lot of ways in which we can
learn from the past and
learn from the past. And let me give you another example of sort of America versus Japan, because one of the ways that, sort of the Americanization, because of MacArthur, the Americanization of Japan was really incomplete. And so there are many things in Japan that are still actually Japanese and that are inexplicable to people who are not Japanese. One of these things that's inexplicable to people who are not Japanese is the fact that there are very few large department stores. There are a lot of small family-owned stores. Now, we Western economists know this to be very inefficient, right? Similarly, if you go and you drive a car in Japan, not only do you have to buy a new car every 3 years because of the inspections, but also if you go and get gas, you will notice that somebody will come and adjust your wiper blades and check your fluids and all. And do you need that? I can tell you as an American, you do not need that. You do not need it at all. And yet, the Japanese, I would say, understand something that we don't, because, once again, solus populi suprema lex, the goal of a country is to flourish. And I would say that economically, a country is flourishing if everyone who is a supplier of labor has demand for that labor, and that labor is something that is equal to the best effort that they can give. And so for a Japanese person, the question is not how many shopkeepers do we need? The question is how many people need to be shopkeepers? The question of how many people need to be shopkeepers to at least the traditional Japanese pre-Washington consensus system, is actually to me, a much more important question. And when we get into AI, which kills human labor like the Industrial Revolution never happened, that question becomes more and more intense because actually you start to need whole classes of people become unnecessary. Right? Most white collar work, the white collar work gets hit before the blue collar work. It's all like it's all falling apart, right? You know, and the reality that you know, if you basically are saying, oh, the country is flourishing if the GDP is the highest, I'm like, well, what if that's just not true, you know? And I think that actually there are many ways in which the Japanese system understands that. That's also Japanese protectionism understands that. And so Donald Trump is starting to realize basically sort of like how that works. You know, it's like there was a great German economist named Friedrich List. I don't know if you know the name Friedrich List, but he invented he wrote in the 1840s a book that nobody read when he was alive. Later on, in the second half of the 19th century, it turned into the German economic miracle of that time.
Yes.
And it also, List, exactly.
You
know, you know List, we don't know List, right? You know, and so the thing is, when Donald Trump says we're losing $800 billion a year to China, if you're a 20th century economist, you're basically like, that means China is giving us $800 billion worth of free stuff, and we're sending them pieces of paper in return. And like, losing, what an unsophisticated way to think about economics. And I'm like, yes, that is literally what happens when you lose money. You borrow money, and so people give you stuff in exchange for promises, right? You know, and it's like actually in the economics of Friedrich List, the trade deficit or the trade surplus is the national profit or loss. It actually makes complete and total sense. And like, you know, the Donald Trump, I guarantee you, has never read Friedrich List. He's just an intuitive thinker. He's just like, intuitively, this doesn't feel right. And everyone goes, well, but the math checks out, right? You know, and it's like, actually, things are being run on the basis of like the math checks out. You know, the ideas were just fundamentally crazy. And so when I look at, you know, I mean, in a way, of course, I think Japan is still a very healthy country in many, many ways. I think it would be much healthier if it were not for the Plaza Accords, in which in the 1980s, Americans sort of strong-armed Japan into accepting Washington economics. And since then, China, which did not accept Washington economics, has zoomed past Japan in many different ways. And it's like, actually, like, no, you know, for countries like Japan and sort of the rest of the world, I find that they're in many ways, they have the same relationship to America that like a teenager has to its parents, where it's like you're created in this system, you're molded by this system, but like you're actually really old enough to see that daddy is not a god, right? Daddy is just a person. He had a mother and a father too. He, you know, probably did bad stuff when he was a teenager, you know, like he's a person. And like to get out of that model of sort of adolescence and to kind of recover a kind of sovereignty is a hard problem. I think that the U.S. should be doing maybe a little bit more under the Trump administration to sort of help its allies recover their sovereignty, sort of like a Gorbachev doctrine, if you know the term. Right. I'd like to see basically really the independence of Europe and Japan really fully restored.
I think you mentioned about decoupling the United States and Japan, and I like to talk about the Plaza Accord, but since the sake of time, I think we need to kind of wrap up. So I'm interested in what you think about AI, because I'm asking this question because I understand that we need you're saying that we need some type of a king or CEO type of president, but when that connects with AI,
let me explain how that connects with.
That's giving too much power. Not military power, political power, but also AI power. That's terrifying for me.
All governments have absolute power, and the thing is, if you assume that a government, first of all, a government that does not have absolute power is a bad government. It's like anarchy. It's like violence in the streets, right? There's always a circle of power which is absolute. And in the world of AI, like we basically, one of the mistakes that American Republicans make is they think that you can be free. They think that anarchy is the same thing as freedom. So Republicans, like they try really hard. They have this very broken identity system where, people have their identity. People lose billions of dollars a year from like stolen identities. You're like, how does this even happen? It's because you're using paper systems from the 1930s to define, identity. So in that sense, actually, a stronger state is a more efficient state, is a freer state. It is actually the web of nonsense and bureaucracy and rules and incompetence and criminality that makes things work poorly. When it comes to AI, there's actually a very simple problem, which goes back to the economic thing that I described earlier. You have to, in the world with AI, to ensure that there is enough labor demand for the labor supply that you have and you can't change, I believe that you have to change the rules in a way, sort of the way Japan has done, where they said, no, how many people need to be shopkeepers? And in a world where basically a lot of, especially the white collar, what we call bullshit jobs have disappeared due to efficiency, I believe that it's actually necessary for the government. I'm not a Luddite in the sense that I believe that we should not have AI, we should not have, silicon, we should have all these things. But I also believe that the main problem of governments in the 21st century will be keeping humans by giving them something to do. And I believe overwhelmingly that the solution to that problem is to take production processes that in the 19th and even 18th century became industrial and move them back to artisanal processes. And I think for the Japanese mind to say, all right, our economy is so efficient that most people are useless. But what if we said, hey, if you want to wear a shirt in Japan, that shirt needs to be made from Japanese fabrics, grown by Japanese people, made by hand by Japanese people in Japan. That's a lot less efficient. That shirt is going to cost you 200,000 yen. I don't know. It will be a very nice shirt, and actually you'll be able to afford it because AI has made the economy much more productive. So that is a level of change and of rebalancing that is takes a Meiji Restoration level of power. You could the Tokugawa, the Bakufu could not do the Meiji Restoration. It needed a different, this is my rage, retire all government employees. You just, even if you don't retire them, even if you don't retire the people, the organizational structures absolutely all need to go. The rules, the laws, it's basically in this kind of change, basically, it's like in Japan in 1945 or Germany in 1945. The old government has absolute power. The new government also has absolute power. And if you tried to do that change of government in a situation in which the new government did not have the same power as the old government, oh my God, there would be death and destruction everywhere. And so actually you can look at that period, especially in Japan. Germany is a more questionable example, but you can look at that period and you can see absolute power applied by liberals, mostly for the greater good. I'm not saying that everything that was done by MacArthur was good. That's clearly not the case. But mostly for the good. And I think the Japanese respect for MacArthur is very justified. I think the Germans have more of a case of Stockholm syndrome. And actually, because that's how you get with governments with absolute power, right? And so I think that it's actually not, for me, the pun of dark enlightenment, it's light, but it's dark, is it's a really beautiful thing. It's like history is actually coming back, and like we just see that the possibility of there's no possibility of small change. But like the possibility of large change, like when you're in a situation where for anything to change, everything has to change. And like, I think that that's something that the second Trump administration, which is much more powerful than the first Trump administration, is still realizing. They're like, wow, this is working 10 times as well as it did in 2017. And yet we're still not at 80%, not at 20%, we're at 2%. And like, we're not getting any farther. Like they moved the needle in their first 3 months, and then the needle stopped moving because it wasn't a full revolution. It was like a piece of a revolution. And so actually and you know, when you look at the people who are like saying like, oh, we can't change the whole government and like have it be a thing like in one moment, I'm just like, no, actually that's the only way we can change it. And it's actually like, people feel that in a way in America, and you see that in Donald Trump's rhetoric.
Yeah.
But in his actions, he's much more like a traditional Republican president. So who knows what the future will bring.
Okay, thank you, Curtis Yarvin. Thank you for the time. There's some points I couldn't agree with you, but I kind of understood what you were thinking about. Excellent. And I'll read your book again and kind of digest what you said.
Excellent. All right.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
I appreciate it. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you. Bye.